Blaire White is a career abuser of trans people online, someone who has carved out a niche for herself by acting as the respectable trans, while simultaneously guiding her audience to attack and abuse any trans person that doesn't look, act, or think like her. And she's more than happy to lie in order to secure herself that position of token privilege. On that basis, I'd just like to start this video by noting the fact that I'd already started making it before I became aware of the whole situation surrounding Janae Marie Kroc. And whilst it would have been easy to switch over to that topic and make the same video as everyone else, I thought it a better use of my time to show further examples of Blaire White knowingly and deliberately lying about the trans community, trans healthcare, and the sciences of both biology and psychology. But before I can do that, I just need to give a content warning for the following: ableism, transphobia, transmedicalism, hate crime, harassment, rape and sexual assault, and domestic abuse.
So a lot more people know a gay person in real life. There's just it's a statistically bigger portion of the population. But like you said, I knew a couple trans people in my life, but like not a lot. And I came from New England in an urban area, right? So if I was out there in the middle of the country, who knows how old I would be before I ever met a single trans person. So that's one of the reasons that, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. It's really harmful that the most vocal trans voices online are crazy people that don't represent the actual average trans person on the street, and they certainly don't represent people like you who are trans but have very reasonable right of center values and political views. How did that happen, and how much damage do these voices do?
First of all, Blaire White is not right of center as typically used. That title refers to someone who's a centrist with right-wing tendencies. Blaire White, on the other hand, is someone who supports and defends far-right politicians like Donald Trump, happily associates with white nationalists like Lauren Southern, and is completely at home appearing on Rebel Media, a self-described far-right platform. Sure, she could be considered right of center in the most blunted sense of the term, since she is technically to the right of the center, but using the same basis, so could every right-wing figure and ideology throughout history. So why does White cling to such a title? Well, it's a form of right-wing identity politics designed to make the person's political stance appear much softer than it actually is. Not only does she avoid the rightfully negative connotations associated with the far right, but she also taps into the fallacy of middle ground. That is, the somewhat inherent yet flawed belief that the best solution is always a compromise between two political extremes. It's the idea that we shouldn't murder all the people or none of the people, just half the people. White, as with other far-right pundits, use this as a means of shielding themselves from criticism whilst propping up their views in a way they can't do through argument, relying strictly on their identifying as right of centre, hence right-wing identity politics. Now, we'll come back to the way in which it's apparently really harmful that the most vocal trans voices online are crazy people that don't represent the average trans person on the street, since White and Polumbo give examples of what they think constitutes psychopathology later on. But for now, I have to ask, how can Polumbo claim to know what does and does not represent the average trans person, considering he flat out admitted to knowing virtually no trans people? Unless he has access to some statistical analysis I'm unaware of and he failed to supply, this seems to be a complete fabrication on his behalf.
Absolutely. So I'll let your audience in on this. Most trans people, and when I say trans people, I know it sounds a bit like whatever, but we're talking about actual trans people, transsexuals, people who transition, not non-binary, not gender non-conforming, not people who slap on a wig and are a different person day to day. We're talking about real trans people. For the most part, their goal in life is to blend in and to be left alone. And that made me seem like an oxymoron for myself because I'm very out there. I have a YouTube channel, I'm a public figure, I do speaking events or whatever. But, you know, for the most part in our day-to-day lives, we like to be just normal and blend in. That is the goal. You transition not to be standing out and looking crazy and being the trans person in the room. You just want to be the girl or the guy or whatever you're transitioning to. So because of that, I think that natural inclination for us to fall back and just live as normal life as possible, because we are aware we're not normal, it creates an opening for the loudest, most rowdy, and most radical among us, and I say us, even though I don't consider them to be us really, to step up to the podium and have the voice, right? That's why, when you turn on the news, and this is another reason why I don't blame conservatives for having any negative feeling for trans people, because if you turn on the news and every time you see something trans, it's some blue-haired person screaming about how all white people are evil and we're going to tear down the patriarchy and cis this, cis that, I too would probably have negative feelings. In fact, I catch myself sometimes as a trans person having negative feelings towards the community. So like I said, because we have the inclination to step back, they step up.
So it's no secret that Blaire White is true scum, sometimes referred to as a trans medicalist. That is, she forwards gender dysphoria as being required in order for a person to be transgender. This is in spite of the fact that the medical consensus, composed of all available scientific data, completely opposes her position. That's why groups such as the American Psychological Association, the US's largest psychological association, make very clear that gender dysphoria is not an essential part of being transgender, nor is adhering to patriarchal gender expectations or even identifying as the opposite binary gender, as White seems to believe, making this nothing more than a classic no true Scotsman fallacy. Now, White has had this fact explained to her enough times over the years that she knows she has no basis for what she says. Something that's important to point out, as throughout the video, both White and Polumbo play a game of pretending that White's position is reason-based when it is, in fact, the exact opposite. Indeed, conservative ideologies don't fare so well when it comes to science because they're rigid by definition, refusing to update with new evidence as it becomes available, something we'll come back to later in relation to biology. So, right-wing politics, as with creationism and similar ideologies, has to constantly reassure itself and its adherents that they see a deeper truth hidden to most people. There's a reason White frames what she's saying as letting Polumbo's audience in on something, rather than referencing any sort of evidence. What's more is, White conflates people standing up for their rights with people wanting to make a scene. The basis upon which she says that, as with the exclusionist remarks, is non-existent. Fact is, I do agree on one thing. Most trans people, myself included, would very much like to sink into the background and be left alone in regards to our trans status. However, this assumes we live in a perfect world, which we don't. Our rights, including basic rights such as the right to access facilities needed to function in day-to-day life, are constantly being attacked. We're also being harassed, abused, and even assaulted in public. We are in the midst of a trans hysteria, an anti-trans moral panic created by anti-trans hostility colliding with a heightened awareness that we exist. As for the trans people who do make a scene, as White puts it, ending up in viral videos and news stories that discuss or show trans people being harassed to the point of breaking, we have to acknowledge the facts that said videos are not shared by the trans person being targeted. They're shared by Blaire White and the people she associates with. They're the people who make these stories go viral. They're the source of the problem. Just see what White did in relation to Tiffany Michelle Moore, also known as the GameStop trans woman, who had a video of her reacting to being repeatedly and deliberately harassed by members of staff go viral. White has made a career out of abusing trans folk who dare show the slightest piece of their humanity as they deal with the violence life throws at them. As for why I do what I do, it's certainly not for the abuse I receive. I've actually attempted to refocus my work several times over the past few years, telling myself that I've already given enough of my mental health to the cause. But every time I do that, something always happens. There's always some big controversy, some new attack on the trans community. And when I hear my trans siblings in pain, my immediate response is not to kick them in the face and pull myself up, but to reach out in an empathic embrace. I have the opportunity to speak out and support others, so that's what I'll do. This is where I make my stand.
And it is unfortunate. And that's why I actually encourage other trans people like myself to speak out. It's very difficult because a lot of the times we naturally believe that our friends and our allies are leftists, right? That's what trans people usually believe. They feel that they're going to have more acceptance on that end, so they keep themselves a bit more quiet. A lot of trans people actually have center-right or conservative beliefs. I have found this.
Blaire White's argument here is reliant not simply on anecdote, but also on survivorship bias. That is, the error of concentrating on the people or things that made it past some selection process and overlooking those that did not. Let's start simple. The very first thing White does in this clip is tell us that any trans person who doesn't match up to her aggressive notions, both of what a trans person is and how certain genders should present, isn't really trans. What's more is, White has cultivated an environment consisting of fascist, white nationalist, and transphobes. So of course, the trans people she comes to know personally are going to be right-wing, racist, and exclusionary like her. So this begs the question, what portion of the trans community is right-wing? Well, thankfully, we have the 2015 US Transgender Survey, which had 27,715 respondents from all 50 states, supplied to me by my editor, Levi. And whilst the general US population was evenly split with 27% identifying as either Republican or Democrat, a whopping 50% of the trans community identified as Democrat and a minuscule 2% identified as Republican, the rest being independent, of course. And whilst a portion of those independents will be right-wing, if party alignment is any sort of general gauge, a much larger number will be far left than far right. So once more, all available evidence contradicts White's narrative.
Because again, and this might be a concept people don't really hear all the time, but I go back to the concept of individualism over collectivism, of personal responsibility, of manifesting your own destiny. That is more so of a right-wing thing, taking care of yourself, setting yourself up for your life. And that's exactly what I did by transitioning. If anything, I kind of did it on hard mode. You know what I mean? I did it on like a difficulty setting that most people don't do. And so because of that, a lot of us actually have those beliefs. You just don't hear about it because, again, we're talking about trans people who transition and then they want to blend in. They want to just be the flight attendant. They want to just be the secretary, just the lawyer, not really on YouTube doing what I do and what a lot of the other crazy people do. So
I'm just going to say it bluntly. If White were truly individualistic, she'd be dead. We as a species are among the most social on this planet, requiring a standardized 16 to 18 years of parental support. This includes things such as feeding, clothing, shelter, education, emotional support, social connections, and so on. Factors that will impact any and all future opportunities a person has. White clearly comes from a privileged background. I know she has some trouble with her extended family on her father's side in her 20s, but that was after 2 decades of education and access to resources many lack. So when she claims her destiny is self-made, what she actually means is she was handed life on a silver platter and believes she deserves personal credit for that. Now there's, of course, nothing wrong with receiving support at home, rather the opposite. But this is like those stories that claim anyone can make it, leaving out the facts that ex-entrepreneur received $1 million investment from their father back in the 70s. It's selective framing designed to promote the myth of meritocracy being the notion that if you work hard, your merit will be recognized and you will be rewarded. In short, the American dream. It's a notion invented by the very people who live off the billions of taxpayer dollars they receive from the government in corporate welfare, whilst paying absolutely nothing back. They created it as a means of distracting from said issue, making out people wanting to access the social care their tax dollars should be spent on as the real bad guys, the dirty scroungers. Now this intersects with the trans experience in a very special way, particularly when it comes to binary trans people who are medically dysphoric. Due to the US Health Department removing medical transitioning from the list of medically necessary treatments back in the 80s, insurers have grounds upon which to reject their claims. This creates a system of haves and have-nots, those who are born into a family background and given a good start in life and can therefore afford premium insurance or to pay out of pocket, and those who do not. Thing is, there is perhaps no greater example of just how bogus the notion of meritocracy is than white herself. If people's wealth was actually based on merit, almost every black mother in America would be a millionaire, whilst white, who does nothing but sell lies online, would be broke. Now, since that isn't the case, it doesn't seem like merit has a whole lot to do with income and opportunity. What's also interesting to point out is how, in spite of accusing the left of collectivism in supporting responsible social care, Blaire White fails to see the greater irony, how her attempting to erase anyone who doesn't look, think, or act like her from the trans community is in actuality her attempting to enforce her own sense of cohesiveness. After all, the video is titled Blaire White, How Radical Left-Wing LGBT Activists Sabotage Trans Acceptance. Well, if you truly manifest your own destiny, why then do you care about what other trans people do? Surely it'd have no impact on your life. That is, unless you're speaking total crap. Your assertion of individualism is at complete odds with your actions, and therefore seems entirely disingenuous.
Well, even I personally can say, like, following your videos has changed the way I think about trans issues and trans people, because it's like, if all you have to go off is the Charlotte Climbers of the world, yikes, right?
Yeah.
Like, these are some crazy people who are constantly spouting crazy things. I mean, to give you an example, there's a huge difference between saying some people are born feeling gender dysphoric. It's not a choice. They can't choose it. And the best thing they can do to be happy in their life is to transition, and other people should respect them, let them live their life how they want.
Yes.
I'm totally down with that. Here's where I lose it. And people like you, I have no issue with, because you don't take these stands, but kind of the leftist, activist, trans leaders and voices, biological sex doesn't exist. There are a million genders. Trans people are being murdered in the streets, despite statistics not bearing that out at all. Misgendering is violence. 10-year-olds can have irreversible hormones and surgery. All these ideas that are just so far out there. And I even, as myself, who's kind of socially libertarian, not some conservative trad, find myself extremely off-put by them. But that's not actually what most people believe, right?
No, I mean, I definitely, all those things you just listed that were the crazy elements of what, the trans sort of movement, I'm against those wholeheartedly. And I've taken a lot of heat from that. And
Yeah.
I think similar, you can probably relate to how the LGBT community, we're talking the loud ones, reacts to us.
So, as already demonstrated, gender dysphoria doesn't define trans people as per the medical consensus on the matter. So again, complete garbage in that regard. However, it's here that Polumbo gives us a glimpse into what he and White think crazy trans people, such as myself, believe. So let's see how honest White and Polumbo are being with their viewers. Now, I'll be responding to these out of order, but I'll be sure to go through each one and give it the time it deserves. Let's start with the assertion that trans leftists believe biological sex doesn't exist, since that's a flat-out lie. The reality is, we acknowledge that biology is a little more complicated than outdated medical science once thought, that the idea of strict sexual dimorphism is a myth, disproven not only by the existence of trans people, but also by the existence of the medically intersex, not to forget your average person. Every human on this planet is a blend of sexual characteristics to some degree. The medically intersex, which still makes up about 2% of the human population, are just the extreme examples of this sort of blending. The perfectly sexually dimorphic person is a myth, a total fantasy. What this results in are cases in which a person requires a mixture of treatments stereotypically associated with either men or women, demonstrating how certain sexual traits and by extension the medical treatment they require are not inherently associated with either of the classical genders, that there is variance outside of this general clustering. Now, how does that relate to gender? Well, gender is the psychological manifestation of sex. That is, it's the result of how the part of your brain responsible for one's perception of sex perceives itself in relation to that. On that basis, we can, and I would argue should, consider being trans a form of psychologically intersex. Now, it's important to update our understanding of biological sex to fall in line with new evidence. Something the right is terrible at, having that conservative element which is the inherent rejection of new things, including new evidence. That's why people often say science has a left-wing bias. It's not because the left is right by default, it's because the left-wing mindset is much more adaptable, much more conducive to adopting new evidence and shifting the paradigm when needed. What White and Polumbo are pretending is the left abandoning biological sex is actually them having their heads jammed so far up their own arses that they fail to realize that the medical consensus hasn't agreed with them for decades. It's at times like these that we see the true irony behind the phrase, "the facts don't care about your feelings," because the right runs almost entirely on pure feeling, mostly fear and anger towards a growing understanding of the natural world. So with that noted, let's move on to the crack about a million genders, since it's so benign. First of all, clear exaggeration designed to make the opposition seem unreasonable. White and Polumbo's problem isn't that there are a million genders, it's that there's more than two. It's the fact that these labels exist as a result of individuals creating more specific terms that help them convey to others how they feel in regards to their psychological sex. Genders, as with all human language, develops where there is a human need to share knowledge. Now, some of these labels come and go as they fail to stick around, but others become more permanent additions to the human language. This is important to note since trans people have always existed, being a universal human experience, and have been culturally significant since at least the late Paleolithic. That's 100,000 years of human culture developing new and improved ways to convey their gender. Now, the reason so few people know about this in the West is because Christianity attempted to erase those identities, starting with Europe during the Christianization of Rome, before later doing so to the rest of the world during the colonial era. This was done to force our understanding of sex and gender in line with biblical teaching. And whilst its success varied outside of Europe, almost all of European trans heritage, language included, was eradicated. But the people persisted, which is why we're creating new labels to replace the ones lost, to convey who we are now that things have become relatively better. That's why it seems new to us, but go talk to a person from India and they may not share that perspective due to the cultural prominence of the Hijra community. Yet whenever a private business like Facebook makes the purely business-based decision to allow for more gender options, reminder that more gender options means more potential users, ergo more people to advertise to and mine for data, the right pretends like this is some new fad, when history proves otherwise. Developing gender labels is as fundamentally human as making fires and telling stories. So White and Polumbo's understanding here is willfully ignorant, ahistorical, and entirely Eurocentric. In short, they have no place to comment on something they've clearly done no research on. But returning to what I said at the start, this is all so benign. White and Polumbo may as well be offended at the fact that there are millions of specific colours. These things exist whether or not you like it, and people always create new labels to describe things if they feel there is a need for it. For people who talk a lot of crap about individualism, White and Polumbo seem pretty upset by the fact that individuals use language to help themselves express themselves, and that language has been used by private businesses to increase profit. It's almost like Polumbo is a far-right stooge pretending to be libertarian for the same purposes as White pretending to be right of centre. Moving forward, we have the claim that the left believes misgendering is violence. Now this one was tricky due to the vagueness of Polumbo's statement, so let us start by making something absolutely clear, and that is the fact that misgendering is harmful, something recognised in peer-reviewed medical journals, such as the Medical Journal of Australia, which stated the following in an article published in August of 2020. Quote, "The impact of stigma and misgendering on the physical and mental health of trans individuals is profound and lasting." End quote. To deny that is to deny the science. Now, does the trans left in general believe misgendering is inherently violent? No. Even people such as Riley J. Dennis, someone White has personally spent years demonizing as the epitome of everything wrong with the trans left, are very clear about the fact that misgendering is only violent if done intentionally, going so far as to state such in the first 11 seconds of her video on the topic, and even repeat the fact that she's talking about intentional misgendering in the video description. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Misgendering, when deliberate, is an act carried out to intimidate or demean the victim, effectively denying that person their humanity. That is textbook harassment, which, yes, is violence and will be treated accordingly. When it comes to accidental misgendering, however, the response is very different. It's actually trans people on the left who are telling cis folk to correct themselves, say thanks to whoever pointed it out, and move on. Again, returning to Riley's video and what she had to say.
"And I know that sometimes you'll misgender someone unintentionally. Maybe you didn't know their pronouns, or you just made a mistake. That's fine. Just correct yourself, move on, and try not to do it again. You don't need to apologize profusely and make a huge deal out of it. That's probably drawing more unwanted attention to the situation anyway."
Now this difference is really important to note since it shows how the trans community's response to misgendering is proportionate to both the intentionality and the degree of harm caused. If done once or twice out of accident, correct yourself and move on. If done as part of an active attempt to harass an individual to make them feel unwelcome in day-to-day life, then treat that in accordance with pre-existing laws on harassment. There's nothing special or unreasonable about that. So for Polumbo to throw out the assertion that the trans left believes misgendering is violence without qualifying this as specifically pertaining to intentional misgendering, which constitutes harassment, is a clear attempt at strawmanning the opposition to make them appear less reasonable than they actually are. It's like telling a victim of stalking that they should stop trying to criminalize sending people flowers as they attempt to get a restraining order against their stalker. You've torn out all the key context and nuance to the point that nothing you say has any value whatsoever. Moving forward to the more serious charges, we have the assertion that the trans left believe that, quote, 10-year-olds can have irreversible hormones and surgery, end quote. This is such a blatant lie that it's frankly disgusting. It would be pointless to put a 10-year-old on puberty blockers, that is unless they suffer precocious or early onset puberty, which is what puberty blockers were actually developed for, meaning said child would be put on them regardless of whether or not they were trans. Children are allowed to socially transition, that is, to have autonomy over their clothing and to choose their name and pronouns. Fully reversible puberty blockers won't typically be prescribed until after 12 years of age, and HRT can't be prescribed until the age of 16. Now, since 16 is the age of full medical consent for cis people in many countries, including here in the UK, to argue against that for trans people would be to declare us second-class citizens with less rights than cis people. So Polumbo lied, and Blaire White supported that lie. Lastly, we come to the way Polumbo presents the idea that, quote, trans people are being murdered in the streets, end quote, is something that is unfounded, and that the discourse surrounding the prevalence and nature of trans homicide somehow harms the trans community. This is actually pretty easy to refute. All I have to do is reference one of the many high-profile cases in which a trans person was murdered for being trans, such as the case of Selena Reyes Hernandez. Now, I'd be completely justified in leaving things there. However, what I think Polumbo was attempting to do was parrot an argument they previously heard about the rates of trans homicide, failing to do so since they never bothered to actually look into the topic. They simply see it as a cheap soundbite. I will admit, we don't know the rate of trans homicide, but that's because we don't know the size of the trans community and we don't know the rate of underreporting. Without knowing both of those factors, the best we can do is estimate, which is exactly what Dr. Alexis Dino set out to do with her paper, Homicide Rates of Transgender Individuals in the United States 2010 to 2014, published in the American Journal of Public Health. Using existing estimates, Dino came up with three numbers in regard to the size of the trans population: 0.1, 0.35, and 0.6%. She then broke underreporting rates down into four groups, assuming transgender homicides weren't undercounted, as well as assuming transgender homicides were undercounted by 20, 50, and 80%. This allowed her to plot 12 estimates of relative risk for the trans community as a whole. Dino then repeated the same process for Black trans women, Black trans men, Latino trans women, and Latino trans men. I should note that Dino was careful to compare ethnicity-specific rates of homicide not to the general population, but to a cis control of the same gender and ethnicity. So Black trans women were compared to Black cis women, meaning the study accounted for extraneous variables such as police brutality targeted at Black and Latino communities. The sample itself was not sourced from official statistics, since they were reliant on voluntary reporting, but were instead sourced from non-government organizations or NGOs, such as Transgender Day of Remembrance and the National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs data. Now, when it came to the total trans homicide rate, 8 of 12 relative risk assessments gave a lower transgender homicide rate than for all residents, though perhaps it would be more accurate to state 5 out of 9 estimates, since we can be relatively certain that there is some degree of underreporting taking place. That it's not about if, but rather to what extent. Either way, this is the likely source of the argument Polumbo is attempting to make. Fact is, it can't be taken to mean that. Why? Well, it's those rates of underreporting, an issue so prevalent that it led another doctor, Rebecca Stotzer, to publish an editorial titled "Data Sources Hinder Our Understanding of Transgender Murders" in the same journal, alongside Dr. Dino's article. The editorial is rather clear in its stance, ending with the statement that, quote, "In that regard, Dr. Dino's work cannot provide a definitive answer to the transgender murder rate, but instead provides a more compelling argument for the advancement of more comprehensive data collection strategies to improve the safety of transgender people." End quote. So what issues may lead to this underreporting? Well, to start with, there are no official statistics on trans homicide. As Dr. Stotzer put it, quote, "The primary method of collecting crime data at the federal level is through the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Uniform Crime Reports, a system in which local law enforcement agencies voluntarily submit crime statistics from their jurisdiction to the Federal Bureau of Investigation each year in aggregate form. Notoriously problematic because of the voluntary nature of the program and the various ways the laws vary or are interpreted across jurisdictions, the Uniform Crime Reports are also often assumed to be a significant undercount of crime." End quote. It's this fact that forced Dr. Dino to source her data from NGOs, something that also carries with it many problems. Primarily, those NGOs were only able to record trans homicides that were themselves reported in the news or to said organisations directly. Trans deaths that weren't reported on, or deaths that weren't reported as being transgender, would not be included, effectively putting Dr. Dino's data at the mercy of the media industry. This study looked at data between 2010 and 2014, meaning its sample ended the year of the trans tipping point that saw trans stories become sensationalized front-page news. We also have to consider post-death erasure of trans lives by family members and members of the local community. Following the death of black trans man, Tony McDade, people were very quick in trying to set out to invalidate his identity, asserting that he wasn't a man, that he was just a tomboyish woman. Thankfully, Tony McDade had people that knew him speak out and share the truth of his identity. But many trans people aren't that lucky. There's a reason people such as Caitlin from Ask a Mortician have to put out videos explaining how trans people can protect their bodies in death. Stories of friends turning up to funerals only to see the body of their friend broken and distorted to fit the gendered norms they thoroughly rejected haunt the trans community. If a mother, father, sibling, or whomever the police or journalist interview on the matter denies their transness, then that's something that will be lost, meaning said death will never be recorded. Then we have to realize that these numbers are not an accurate depiction of the current rates of homicide reported by NGOs. Again, this sample was from 2010 to 2014, meaning it came before the trans tipping point and the subsequent trans hysteria. These murders came before the arguments and the TV spots painting trans people as predators, breaking into bathroom stalls to rape women and children, indoctrinating children into medicalized trans ideology. This would be like taking the rates of anti-Muslim violence prior 9/11 and extrapolating that as being representative post 9/11. Indeed, Dino's article even stated such with quote, "This enumeration of transgender homicides includes numbers for 2015 and 2016, and the numbers for both years were much higher, 24 and 24, than those for any previous year. The National Centers for Health Statistics final data from 2015 and 2016 were not published at the time of the study, so I excluded those years from analysis." End quote. However, in spite of all this, one thing the study does show is that the rates of homicide suffered by both Latino and black trans women are higher than Latino and black cis women. Assuming a large trans population and that every case of homicide of a Latino trans woman was reported, the lowest relative risk estimate for Latino trans women was still 1.4 times higher, with the highest estimated homicide rate being 43.8 times higher than Latino cis women. Meanwhile, assuming the same for black trans women, the lowest estimate for them was a homicide rate 2.35 times higher, with the highest estimated homicide rate being 74.9 times higher than black cis women. So even at the lowest estimate accounted for, assuming a large trans population that all cases were reported, it is fair to say that Latino and black trans women face higher rates of homicide than their cis counterparts. And regardless of whether Blaire White and her white nationalist friends would like to pretend like they don't, the lives of trans people of colour matter. What's also interesting to point out is how the 0.1% trans prevalence rate would be in line with Blaire White's exclusionist definition of trans people, limiting what it means to be trans down to dysphoria and medical transitioning. Fact is, at this size, any undercount estimate would result in the trans community having a higher homicide rate than the general population, ranging anywhere between 1.07 and 4.28 times higher. And since we can be relatively certain that there is a degree of undercounting, this would make White's earlier statements contradict her agreement with Polumbo here. Either she's right about what makes a real trans person, in which case we do know they have higher rates of homicide, or she's wrong, in which case we just don't know at the moment. There's just no way for Blaire White to be correct about both points. But even if she were right, all of this fails to account for the fact that body count is not the only way to measure violence and harm. We also have to consider the impact and the ferocity of the violence. The reason a hate crime is treated more severely than a non-hate crime is because a hate crime impacts a community as a whole. When a Jewish person is targeted with anti-Semitism, it's not just the person targeted who suffers. It's all Jewish people in the relative vicinity. Now, one impact this can have, as discussed by Dr. Dino and subsequently Dr. Stotzer, is that this can result in entire demographics limiting their freedoms to remain safe. That is, when a trans person becomes aware of the violence targeted towards them, they can begin to limit their movements and their contacts. And whilst this is completely understandable, it's still not a solution, even if it does decrease the number of trans homicides. Everyone has the right to life, liberty and security of person, and that includes trans people. We also cannot understate the ferocity of the violence inflicted upon trans people, another point raised by Dr. Stotzer. Do you remember Selena Reyes Hernandez mentioned earlier? She was a 37-year-old trans woman who lived in Chicago when 18-year-old Orlando Perez met her and asked if she was a woman. When Selena told him she was transgender, he left, only to return later and shoot her in the back of the head. Yet here's the real scary part. Even though she was dead and Perez had left the scene, he returned a second time, just so he could shoot her body again. This is a person he'd only met that day, and he not only returned to shoot her, but he came back a second time to shoot her dead body. This overkill, as Dr. Stotzer puts it, feeds into the impact mentioned earlier. It's the bigot in question sending trans people the message that their existence is vile and that this is what they deserve. This sort of desecration of the body, including genital mutilation, is something the statistics don't quite capture. Yet it nonetheless plays an important part if, for nothing else, making the motivations of the killer very clear. That many of these killings are not incidental murders of trans people, they're murders targeting the victim over their trans status. The last point I'd like to make is that homicide is not the be-all, end-all of anti-trans violence. Returning to the 2015 US Transgender Survey, 47% of all transgender people have been sexually assaulted. 10% of those who came out had been assaulted by a family member as a result, and 8% had been kicked out of their house. Out of those who were out at school, 54% had been verbally harassed, 24% physically assaulted, and 13% sexually assaulted. In the year prior to filling out the survey, just 1 year, 30% of respondents who held a job reported being fired, denied a promotion, or experiencing some other form of mistreatment in the workplace due to their gender identity or expression, such as being verbally harassed or physically or sexually assaulted at work. So rather than making this about a topic we're still gathering data on, how about we focus on the data we currently have?
For me, other than I'd say probably J.K. Rowling at this point, I'm probably the most hated person in the trans community, or the biggest target of the trans community, I should say. She's not trans.
She's got you beat though.
She did. I was up there, and then she swooped in, took the crown. And I just did a video defending her, and I like her a lot. But so, you mentioned before that it does a lot of damage to actual trans people, in the same way that I think, a lot of the more radical activists that talk about all LGBT issues harm gay people as well. And I think the most important thing is for us to actually keep standing up and speaking out, because the fact that so many in our community who maybe have the same beliefs as us, the more moderate beliefs, the fact that we choose to be quiet about it for fear of backlash from the mob, it makes it seem like the very vocal insane minority is the majority, and they feel very powerful. And, you know, I think that's a microcosm of what everyone, you know, on the right talks about, the silent majority, about how, you know, people aren't actually okay with all the crazy stuff happening in the country. They're just quiet because they don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want to compromise their friend circles, opportunities, etc. It's the exact same thing in the LGBT community, I find.
You do know Janice Raymond is still alive, right? Raymond is the bigot who first argued that trans women were appropriating womanhood to engage in what she called the covert rape of lesbians in published media. In fact, she argued the very act of a trans woman declaring her womanhood was rape of the female body, stating that, quote, all transsexuals rape women's bodies by reducing the real female form to an artifact, appropriating this body for themselves, end quote. All of which she published in her 1979 book titled The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male, a book I have had the personal displeasure of reading back in 2015 on account of Know Thy Enemy. The following year, Raymond was approached by the US government-funded body, the National Center for Healthcare Technology, to write and present an article on the, quote, social and ethical aspects of transsexual surgery, end quote. An article that repeated most of Raymond's baseless claims and was in turn used as justification to change the government's official stance. Prior to Raymond's presentation, the government had ruled medical transitioning as medically necessary. That meant public and private insurers had no grounds to reject coverage of trans care. Only after the National Center for Healthcare Technology published her piece, which was purely opinion-based, lacking any substantial evidence, did the government adopt her stance as their own, stripping the trans community in America of the guarantee that medical insurers would have to support them in transitioning. So, on one hand, we have the woman who is single-handedly responsible for decades of suffering for the American trans community, whilst on the other we have a lying piece of shit YouTuber. Yeah, you're a terrible person, but stop pretending like you're somehow more important than you are. I mean, I'm pretty certain more people know who Liz Truss and Rosie Duffield are, and subsequently hate them for the shit they've pulled. Hell, even on YouTube, people such as Rose of Dawn are far worse than you. Sure, you're a sick capitalist willing to hurt your entire community for your own gain, but I've not seen the same levels of sadism I see in Rose of Dawn as I've seen in you. But acknowledging all this doesn't feed your ego, so you ignore it. Fact is, this entire line of thought thoroughly undermines White's earlier argument. When she states that, quote, for me, other than I say probably J.K. Rowling at this point, I'm probably the most hated person in the trans community. Or the biggest target of the trans community, I should say, she's not trans, end quote. That undermines the assertion that the majority of the trans community actually supports her. She's either the trans community's most hated individual, or she's the saint of the silent majority. She cannot have it both ways, making this whole ordeal a rather internally inconsistent mess. Moving forward, I have to be frank here. I wasn't expecting White to mention the silent majority. When I was first watching the video, I expected I would have to be the one to point out that she was falling back on a fascist dog whistle. I didn't expect her to come out and admit it so boldly. Staking a claim to the silent majority without statistics, particularly in relation to conservatism, is a method of social control and manipulation. Oddly enough, it's White relying on strict social cohesiveness over apparent individualism. Yet the fact remains that the vast majority of trans people do not support White and her views. She has no basis to claim otherwise, and is therefore actively lying to her and Polumbo's audience when she boldly asserts such. But I guess when you have nothing to back up your position, lying is all you have left to turn to. Yet we have to acknowledge the harm those lies cause the trans community, since, unlike her, we can actually show that to be the result of her actions. Whilst White and Polumbo have failed to show any apparent harm caused by the radical left-wing LGBT activists, What we can see is Blaire White routinely lying as a means of encouraging her fanbase to seek out and abuse innocent trans people. That is why the majority of trans people reject her. Not because they have a form of psychopathology, but because Blaire White is scum. She's a liar and a career abuser, and no amount of fake-ass apologies will make up for that. Now, if you appreciate what we do here on the channel, do know that you can support us via Patreon. We no longer monetize our videos, meaning that Patreon is the sole source of income for the channel, allowing us to keep it running. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following patrons: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Soran Katie, Gerrit Van Voorst, Wellington Marcus, Sosh Daniels, and Justin Allen. And for myself, Adita and Levi, take care now.